Welcome back, and a warm welcome to all our new guests that is joining us here this afternoon. I hope you had a moment to see the exhibition and to settle after the first part of the day. Let's carry that sense of pause with us and now explore how strategy, policy, and vision can actually take form in the world that we build together. Meanwhile, on the first floor, Dan Hallemar is opening our book stage. But here on the main stage, it's time for our next keynote speaker. And to guide this conversation, we are fortunate to have one of Sweden's, my opinion, sharpest urban planners and architecture theorists, Helen Runting. Please come to the stage.
Thank you, Angelica. We got a mic on? Yes. And I'd also like to thank, beyond Angelica's amazing curation of this event, Tove, Lena, and everybody involved in organizing this day, which provides, I think, an amazing opportunity for us to breathe out, breathe in, speak together, and think together in a time that is increasingly devoid of such moments. So thank you, everybody involved in the organization of today. I'd also like to thank Berku Celine for the moving text this morning. I think we need more poetry in our profession, and especially poetry that moves us and makes us think and reflect upon what we are doing. My name's Helen Runting. I'm a director of Secretary, which is a design and research office based in Stockholm, and I'm also co-curator of the Bruges Triennale for 2027, which we've had a small introduction to through Daniel and Eino's really inspiring lecture this morning. But for now, my job is to introduce and then moderate a very short panel discussion. Again, the irony is not lost in a theme of slow down on, we might call it the chronopolitics of architecture, architecture's time politics. I'll introduce some of the themes a little bit in just a second, but I think we're all very curious to hear from our three speakers. So this panel brings together three very different disciplines positions, although there is a slight Belgian focus in two of our speakers. And I'll introduce them in greater detail as they take the stage, but we will be hearing from Sietse Van Doorslaer, Michael Ghyoot, and Indy Johar. With no further ado then, I would like to invite Michael to join me on the stage here. He'll tell you more about his practice, but I've been an admirer of Rotor's work for a very long time. They are a Brussels-based collective dedicated to, I guess, the collection and redistribution of salvaged building materials, amongst other things, and have been a really important voice in the reuse discourse. So thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for the invitation and the introduction. I would like to present you today three projects that we've been working on at Rotor, but maybe first to introduce myself. I'm working for Rotor, which is actually a two-headed entity. So we're located in Brussels, and on one hand we have a non-profit organization that's doing a wide range of projects and missions, mostly regarding the reuse of building elements and the retention of buildings. So recently we've been pretty much involved in a lot of ongoing construction projects where we try to foster these issues. And on the other hand, we have Rotor DC that was created in 2016 as a cooperative company, which is focusing on salvaging reusable building elements and putting them back on the market. So basically, the business model of Rotor DC is selling materials for reuse. So it's no problem. So the first project I want to talk about is sort of a side project I contributed with colleagues and former colleagues that are now working for the Ghent University. And actually it came as a commission from the Jenks Foundation. Maybe you are familiar with Charles Jenks. He was a famous architecture historian in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and he made this very well-known chronogram, as he called it, and I thought it was interesting to mention that in the discussion about chronopolitics. So here it's an attempt to pinpoint or to map different architecture trends in the, let's say, 20th century. The Charles Jencks Foundation is now commissioning a diversity of practitioners to produce new forms of this kind of chronograms. And our mission was to make it for circular construction. And so we decided to use a sort of a linear life cycle approach for the x-axis, and you see there we start from the extraction of the materials, the transport, the manufacturing, then the building phase, then the use and or preservation phase, and then demolition, reuse, recycling, waste. And we did that for a series of periods. So we started back in 1750, and then we go up to now. This is an intermediate moment, 1950. We decided to use just time as the y-axis, so it starts from the past and it goes to now. We assume the totally anachronic aspect of speaking of circular practices in a period where this term was not even coined, but we believe there are a lot of very good examples of circular practices in the past, and it would be a pity not to consider that. So this was an opportunity to do so. So that gives an overview of the, let's say, the background of our chronogram, and then we started populating it first with a bunch of inventions. There are hundreds of them, which most of them are lending the practices towards more linearity rather than more circularity. So obviously the invention and the innovation in transports, in streamlining the whole process just makes the consumption of material easier and the discarding as easier. And so you see all the black spots on the backdrop. These are all the inventions that we could pinpoint. And then we added yet another layer, that's the orange one, about circular design theories, so mostly discourses or ideas that have been put forward in the different, let's say, steps of this life cycle. This gives you an overview of the whole table, of the whole chronogram. This is a close-up on the upper part, so you see the different orange notions that speaks of different notions that were coined at specific moment in time. And then we go down up to the contemporary world. This is the lowest part. You see that the amount of waste that is produced in the end is just growing throughout the centuries, and equally the size of the extraction practices is just growing similarly. So this is a very close-up with a few notions that we will maybe talk about later on this day that are certainly present in the exhibition in the floor below. But what we wanted to show in a way was that there is an increasing gap between what is actually going on in the construction industry, which is not going towards more circularity. On the other hand, there is also an increasing production of new concepts, new ideas, new practices that are sometimes tested in niches, in local projects. And so the question is a bit, how can we bridge that gap? And that's the question mark we ended up in that project. And a way to answer that is maybe a second project I want you to present. I want to present to you, sorry. It's called Opalis. It started back in 2011, so it's a long ongoing project in which we try to map all the salvage dealers, all the companies that are active in salvaging building materials. We started around Brussels and then we progressively extended to nearby countries. You see that there are like hundreds of them, literally hundreds of them. Most of them are very small companies, sometimes sole traders, so it's very easy to overlook them, although their practices are quite inspiring at many levels. So our methodology is to pay a visit to most of these companies to try to understand better how they work, what they are doing, and doing so we better understand what are the big obstacles for these companies to develop in a way. So we also see a lot of different materials. Some companies are super specialized, for instance, here in the reclamation of bricks. Others are a bit more generalist, you may say, as this big demolition company that has opened a sort of a salvage depot around the corner. We also see some kind of structural elements, this kind of wood. Seems that there is a small mistake in the presentation. I like the part about Rotor DC. I'm afraid I will have to do it without images then, but that was the third project I wanted to show, which is a sort of continuity with this, let's say, field research on the salvage dealers. We realized that some dots needed a connection. There were some materials that were not present on the reclamation market, especially materials coming from the renovation and the transformation of contemporary buildings, especially in the city of Brussels, where there are a lot of offices buildings that are being constantly transformed. And we thought, okay, maybe there is something to do about that in our practice. So we developed initially a very small project that grew in terms of the quantity of materials we are able to salvage, and the kind of a professionalization we had to undergo to be able to manage all those materials. What is maybe important to conclude is you may say that the deconstruction activity is closely linked to the demolition of buildings, and in a way it's true. But what we found out in our practices of no more than 10 years of salvaging is the less you demolish, the better you salvage. The reason of that is that usually if you demolish a complete building in a matter of a few weeks, there is just no time for any salvage of any sort, because you have to deal with just huge quantities of materials. And similarly, when you have to rebuild a building of the same size, which is what happens most of the time in a city like Brussels, where you build the city over the city. When you need to bring like the quantity of materials that are necessary to rebuild an entire building, it's almost impossible to bring in reusable materials, to bring in reclaimed materials, or they will remain very anecdotal, maybe 1%, maybe 2%, but never more, because the market in its current state is just unable to provide more quantities, bigger volumes. However, if you preserve as much of the existing building as possible, not only do you lower the amount of waste that is produced, but you also increase the possibility for high reclamation rate and the possibility to bring in salvaged materials to be reused, or bio-based materials. So we really believe this notion of reuse should go hand in hand with that of preserving the existing building stock. And I will finish on that note.
And should your missing slides turn up at some point, we can do a very quick recap at the end. Thank you for taking us through that orally. So our next speaker joining me here on the stage is Sietse Van Doorslaer, who's joining us from Bouwmeester Maître Architecte in Brussels, which in Swedish we might call a stadsarchitect, perhaps a city architect, but that also acts as an independent advocate for architectural quality. I'm very excited to hear what you have to share with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm a bit sweaty because I had a little slowdown on the airport as well because of cyber attacks. So slowdown sometimes can give you some stress, to be honest. But I'm happy I made it. I'm Sietse Van Doorslaer. I'm a trained architect, and for the last 4 years I've been working as a research by design researcher at the Bouwmeester. I'm quickly gonna sketch what we do as a Bouwmeester, and then I'm gonna go deeper in like what Maarten already said about reuse. For us, it's like more the part of the administration, because you're not only changing the how you build, it's also how you have to cope with it in at administration level. So I want to go deeper in that kind of subject, actually. So we're in Brussels. Everybody knows what Brussels is. We have almost 1,300,000 inhabitants on a very rather small piece of land. well connected in the Blue Banana between Paris, Amsterdam, Stuttgart, Düsseldorf, and London. We're also a very kind of complicated country with 3 regions, 3 communities. And then in Brussels itself, you have the Brussels region. So we as a Bouwmeester, we work for the Brussels regions. But inside you also have the city of Brussels. So it's a layer of a layer of a layer of administrations, really a lasagna of administrations. And that's where we come in. And we always make the joke, if you understand it, that means that I didn't explain it correctly. So it's a very complicated kind of structure. I think it's best shown here. This is a picture taken in winter time, and it's kind of strange that you take a detour, but it becomes kind of clear once you put the limits of the different municipalities in there. So like there misses a kind of a glue, because every municipality has its own mayor, his own administration. They have their own kind of political ideology, because sometimes the mayors are not from the same political color. So kind of a potpourri of different kind of ideas to work with. On top of that, Brussels is also the second most diverse city in the world behind Dubai. So you don't have like a diversity of municipalities, you also have a very big diversity of people living there. What do? We are the Bouwmeester. We actually we come in as a kind of neutral position between those. So we promote spatial quality. So like we try to usher up the spatial quality not only on an architectural scale, but also on urban planning and also in a public space level. We do that through urban development projects for the public, but also for the private developers. That's kind of unique in Europe, I think, because mostly Bouwmeester as city architect works for the public sector. We also work for the private sector in the region of Brussels, and from an independent, most neutral position. So we don't have a kind of political affiliation. Everything is political, but we try not to be political. So we had 3 Bouwmeesters. Christian Bret just finished his last mandate. For the moment, we're a bit in limbo because we don't have a Brussels government and we don't have a Bouwmeester, but the team continues. Current affairs. This is the team. We're almost at 15. I think it's also the biggest team of the whole of Belgium, because it's necessary, because actually what we mostly do is we call it soft power. Like for us, hard power is about like deciding. Soft power is more about influencing, building up arguments and convincing. And that's also bring us back to the part I'm going to talk later about, is how to change the thinking of the administration for like reuse or circularity, for instance. We do that with 3 main pillars. Like first of all is the organization of competitions. We almost organize 1 competition a week: an architectural competition, urban space competition, urban planning competition, and ID competitions. Second pillar is where I work most for, is a research by design. So we noticed like a lot of clients came over with us with Excel sheets, very long list of square meters. We try to put back actually the kind of drawing in that kind of conversation of the administration. So we do kind of simulations, we do drawings to make it more clear that sometimes what the developers ask for is a bit too much. And then the last, and that's the legal part, is asking for design review. Every single new building that's being built in Brussels above 5,000 square meters needs a design review by the Bouwmeester team. So it has to be attached to their building permit. And the other part is what we do is working around topics. We had some topics going on, the productive city. That's like to bring productivity more in the cityscape now. That's been going on for 12 years. And the thing I'm here for to talk about is actually the architecture of reuse in Brussels. All of these publications you can also download at our website. So we started actually the question from, is circularity in architecture actually an innovation? Because today in Brussels, circularity and reuse have become a kind of a buzzword, thanks mostly to Rotor, since they've been doing it for almost 20 years in Brussels, and they were kind of the the fire starters of that kind of idea of reusing circularity. But if we actually go back and we see this kind of image, it's a city palace built in the 16th century in Brussels, and it's been dismantled in the early 20th century to have make way for the north-south railway connection. But I don't think you can clearly see it, but here there is a little placard which said facade to sale. So in that time, actually, people were already using kind of the materials in an other way. And actually through industrialization, but also through standardization, we kind of lost that way of reusing materials or the circularity in a way, because it became just more attractive and less pricey. But then actually, if you go back, the problem in building with new materials creates an enormous amount of waste. So here, not only during the productions of the materials, but also when a building is being demolished. That's the kind of annual construction waste in Belgium that's higher than the Pyramid of Giza, if you compare it. So yeah, sometimes it's not easy to demolish because you have an heritage value, or you're people are emotionally attached to a kind of a building. But what about all those? Are you still hearing me? Is it still okay? Yeah, okay. But with all those kind of bland 90s, empty, discarded offices, buildings that we have a lot of in Brussels, many stand empty now because of Corona, because of the shift of teleworking, but also because most of them are not really up to the regulations or the standards anymore. So what do we do with this? Because you could almost draw a line with the post-industrial city, where the offices are the new warehouses and maybe the business parks are the new brownfields. Do we always have to demolish, or can we do something more with it? Do they deserve a second life? And that's why we in 2017 organized a public debate under the title, Should I Stay or Should I Go? Again, that kind of soft power policy setting that we do as a Bouwmeester to get the mindset for what's to come in the future in a way. For instance, this is an example of a competition that we organized with the Bouwmeester in 2015. This is an old office building for a bank, and we organized it together with the owners. And you can see only 10 years ago, the idea was completely demolish it and change it with a new kind of hotel, housing, and office building designed by office Kersinger David van Severen. Today, this kind of project would be unthinkable in Brussels, to be honest. Because if you look at the carbon footprint of a building, you see most of the kind of carbon, it's called the embodied carbon. More than the half is almost in this in the beginning of this life circle. And then actually the rest over, it's less than half of it. That's the operational carbon footprint. So you can see that almost renovating even a part of 2/3 of a part of a building is always better for the CO2 emission or the footprint of new buildings than completely demolishing, because all the stored energy that is being used here, if you do a demolition completely, it's all lost and you have to do it anew. Let's skip over this. So in the past, we mostly preserved mainly buildings for their heritage value. Today, even the most banal buildings hold a new kind of value in a way. It's a value of the embodied energy stored in their materials. And it's also the energy we save if we don't demolish. Whether it be part of the structure or a part of the facades. It's kind of petrified energy in those buildings. So we started off with some pioneering projects, and if you look at the project that came across our desk, we see that there is not one single way of being circular. In fact, over the past few years, many practitioners, architects, planners, public or services or promoters have been actively experimenting with circular principles, each in their own way. For instance, and this is a project also done by Rotor, it's Sinneke, together with the Architectural Office of West. This is actually experimenting with material use, used windows, used staircases, implemented in a building. Another way is also with the creation of new materials from BC Materials. Maybe you heard about them. It's also a Brussels-based office. They use kind of excavated materials or earth from construction sites in Brussels to make their own bricks. A third way is like, for instance, the example of Mobilis of Xavier de Geiter architects is oversizing your buildings to in order to anticipate further adaptation of the building already. And the last way is also kind of the matchmaking. We do that sometimes a lot with the Bouwmeester as well, as matchmaking between different kind of programs. Because existing buildings, they have to fit for certain it's not always like a completely match between a program and an existing building, so the matchmaking is very, very important in order to avoid demolition. For instance, this is a very old hangar, a stocking, a stockage place where they put in a new school with the maintenance of of most of the building. And the last one is actually the readaptive use of structures and building. This is the example of the Zin Tower. Used to be the old World Trade Centers in the north quarter of Brussels, where they kept the foundation but also the cores, and they reused the concrete of the previous slabs in the new slabs. And now it's housing the Flemish government, but also the Standard Hotel from New York is there. And they added kind of a new greenhouse with there, and on every single floor there is greenhouses now as well. So it's that's also a way of doing it at circularity. The second thing is actually mainstream, because it's why the pioneer project, the first project that were like working with circularity in Brussels. And to do that, actually, the first question is, can we easily integrate circular construction into the existing regulations? So in Brussels, the Brussels new building code takes a major step in that current logic where demolition can proceed without justification. So like instead of for a building permit to just have plans for demolition, we ask now through a life cycle assessment that to show us, the government, that demolition is the last and only viable way. So it's kind of changing the way about making architecture. Just like sometimes the demolition plans are an afterthought. Here we just have to really have to show it's the only if it's shown it's the only way, then there can be a demolition. For the material use, we try to do it as well, but for instance, to impose a minimum of reused materials in the project, but it's kind of a difficult one because we're not there yet, because like the challenge lies in how to measure the quantity of the reuse. Like, is it by mass? Is it by volume? Is it by economical value? So we still have to find a way over there, but like we're starting off with that kind of demolition phase already. So it's something to work on in the future more. But in the meantime, we already see that even on the ground, the architects and the developers go faster in administration, because for instance, this is the example of a kind of redevelopment in the European quarter, which used to be a very kind of mono-functional office space. They're a developer together with some architects under the title of City Forward. Almost 30,000 square meters of empty office space is going to be reused and going to be changed in programs. It's almost 20 buildings across the European quarter. So that's on a very large scale, a kind of reuse of buildings and materials going on in the European quarter, where we work together with the European Union for. Changing the rules is one step. But like Martin already said, we also have to rewrite the kind of construction industry, because like working with reused materials, it also needs a change in mindset for the logistic chain of materials. So for example, between dismantling a building and reusing its materials, the storage of those materials becomes a very critical link. That's like what Martin showed with the Opalis. We need some extra space. It's not like directly from the seller to the buyer. We need something in between steps. So we have a couple of, or you take the materials that are on site and you have to stock them on the site, or you dismantle it and you store it somewhere, like for instance at Rotor's place, or you take materials from an all other different site and then they have to be stocked somewhere as well, but they also have to be, it becomes longer the steps in between, so it has to be changed. Next to the new regulation, but also rethinking the supply chain, we also have to think about like change the mindset of administration and how we conceive architecture. For instance, this is one of the first building permits in Brussels, where the windows, normally in the building permit you have to give the size of the windows, the colors of the windows, the color of the tiles. Here, the building permit was introduced with just dotted lines with a maximum of the openings of the windows, because they didn't know which kind of windows they were going to be able to do there. So it took a very long process, but we finally got it together, all together, like that was okay to have this kind of building permit going in. Then, in the next step after they was granted the building permit, there was a kind of big inventory of the existing windows. And because of, remember, those kind of little dotted lines, the architects could play freely with the windows and made like even a window that was normally upside, turn it in the other way around in a way. So it creates kind of a nice playground and a kind of experimentation to it, but you have to give all those administration also in that kind of thinking, because normally it's really strict. So it needs kind of flexibility from the administration side as well. Another option is also to choose from the beginning with materials that are like stocked somewhere, like this, for instance. This was an equestrian center somewhere south of Brussels, where the wooden beams were going to be dismantled to be integrated in a new waste managed park. Do I have to stop? Okay. So like, but it also needs kind of, that's the last thing I want to say about this. It also needs kind of another rethinking of a structural integrity, because it's been used, the materials are being used and they can handle it, but once you take it from one side to another, they have to be like re-regulated. That's why you have like a double wooden beam here, just to have a structural insurance, just to be sure. How many minutes do I still have? Do I stop? Yeah, okay. So, and then last question, and I'm gonna stop. Does circular architecture really look circular? In a way, you can do it. Let's like for instance, the example of Seneca, where you can really see it's been reused materials. But on the other side, sometimes you don't even notice it's reused materials. This is the multi-tower in Brussels. And this is actually like the developer want to have a trademark that he like position himself in a way that they are a sustainable player. But if you look at the building, you wouldn't almost notice it's like reused materials, because the structure is completely reused and the materials outside are taking offsite from other sites, like the flooring, the windows, they're all from somewhere else. But it looks like a normal kind of office building. And then to change, to stop, like for us, circular architecture starts from what's already there, like the as found, as built, on the qualities that already exist. This contextual approach stands opposite to starting each project from scratch in a way, from a blank page, so not only signed by an architect. So the question between circularity and reuse for buildings and materials is also the question of authorship in such projects is much more complex, because circular architecture is a collaborative act and also a kind of reinterpretation of existing rather than a solely original work in a way. So that was really fast, and this is the website where you can download all the kind of leaflets or books if you want to.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I feel like we're getting some very compressed impressions here, all in a row, and it's with my great pleasure then to introduce our final speaker in this bracket, Indy Johar, coming from Dark Matter Labs. Dark Matter Labs is I would say, a new kind of part of a new breed of design strategists, looking to the structural context above, beyond, and maybe below what we would consider architecture's traditional zone of competence. So I'm sure that you'll expand upon that introduction. Welcome to the stage. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to stay within 10 minutes. So I'm going to try to do this quite tight.
Switch.
Sorry. I'm going to try to do this quite tight. What I'm going to focus on is the problem space. You've heard lots of solutions, and I'm going to ask you about whether they're reflective of the problem, right? Because I sometimes worry that our solution spaces are generative of where we are and what we can do better, but they're not reflective of the problem space. So, how many homes do you think the UK can afford to build every year if it was to stay within Paris Accords? 14,000 homes a year. It's currently planning on building 350,000 homes. If it chooses to do retrofit, it can't even do 14,000 homes. How many homes do you think Denmark can afford to build, or Sweden can afford to build, or Brussels? You start to very quickly realize is we don't actually have the carbon budgets to do any of the building. So we now have a bunch of architects all saying, let's do retrofit. Unfortunately, we don't have the embodied carbon to do material retrofit. If we'd said that in 2004 and had done that between 2004 and 2025 in the 21-year period, we could have done this. That time frame is gone because we don't have the explosion of carbon, embodied carbon, that we'd have to release into the world to pull that back. So we're now in a world of energy surplus retrofits, low material retrofits, virtually not touching our buildings. So problem number space one, what does that do? Actually, we don't have the space to build anything. We don't have the space to build retrofits. We virtually have the space to build nothing. So what do you have to do? Whole new ways. You have to maximize the utilization of your existing building stock. What happens if you double the utilization of Copenhagen or Malmö? A school, an average school in the UK, is used 17% of its time. 17% is the utilization rate. That's our problem space, number one. So, you judge whether the solutions we're doing are good enough to the problem space. Second problem, the temperature problem. How hot do you think our cities are going to be over the next period? We are likely moving towards 3 degrees warming. That is the landscape. And I'm ignoring all the sociological, cultural issues, and I'm going to bring them up in a second. 3 degrees warming on average is 5 degrees warming on land, is 8 degrees warming in our cities. The other side of the problem is that if we lose the AMOC current, which is most likely Northern Europe will go about 20 degrees cooler. So the range of our built environment will have to expand by being 8 degrees warmer and 20 degrees cooler. Now how do we deal with our building stock in that context? Third dimension, labor. I don't know about your politics, but in the UK, the politics of actually providing labor for construction is virtually impossible now. The demographics of most of our civilizations are effectively reducing and aging. We don't have the labor force to do the buildings that we're talking about. So if you want to do a whole city retrofit for Malmö or any of the big cities, you don't have the labor force, I suspect. Certainly not in the labor force in the time. So what does that mean in terms of how do we actually build the transformations required? So under 3 parameters, we don't have the embodied carbon budget. 2, the ranges of our built environment are going to change radically. And 3, we don't have the labor forces. These are constraints. And 4, what I would suggest to you is the biggest challenges that we have is the loss of social stability right now. So we're going to see nutrition, for example, prices of nutrition are going up. Energy prices in the US are scaling, and they're going to scale all over the world because we're going to see energy inequality become a strategic issue. And what we're losing is social cohesion. And it's in that context the future of urbanism is going to be built in. I'm really sorry to break this to you, and I've got 4 more minutes, that I think we're building illusions and ideas of the future rooted in the visions of 20 years ago, and that world is gone. The world is gone. Just follow the science. Don't follow my words, do the research, figure it out. And then it opens up a real challenge as architects. What's our contribution? How are we going to think about this future? And almost certainly, when you start to really think about this future, you're going to have to think fundamentally differently. Like programmatically Form does not follow function in this future. You're going to talk about landscape or aprogrammatic buildings, the work that we're doing around aprogrammatic buildings. You're going to have to change, like what's it, average Copenhagen, no, the Copenhagen stats, Danish person, 65 square meters per person. Really? That's where we want to be? So how do we maximize, how do you decrease that? Material utility. Material sufficiency will become a key issue. So what is material sufficiency? An intangible abundance of cities. How do we operate into that reality? I don't say this to put constraints on you. I'm saying that's the constraints that are being put on us. What I am saying, though, is on the basis of that constraints, I think we're living into a completely different future. So if I look at it at a thermodynamic level, what we're almost saying is high energy architecture, low material use. That's the future in certainly Scandinavia, where we have access to renewable energies. In places like Africa, that's not the solution, or in India, that's not the solution, because the surplus energy doesn't exist. So our transitions are going to be focused on the thermodynamics of it. And we're going to have to maximize the sufficiency and utilization of our material uses, and we're going to have to look at actually how we do this in a post-labor or low-labor economy. That is your design parameters. And I think they change fundamentally the architecture that we build in a more radical way than we ever imagine. And it challenges all the bullshit Scandic aesthetics of like white walls and timber. Like all this stuff is gone. You know, let me explain something. If you have a timber chair, right, you own the responsibility of holding that sequestered carbon for 500 years. That carbon has to be sequestered for 500 years. 500 years. Every piece of timber. So whenever you use sacrificial timber, you're going to release that carbon almost certainly back into the environment, unless you have a very good end-of-life management theory. So when we do timber houses, it's not sufficient. We're going to talk about how we sequester and hold that carbon for 500 years. And most of our carbon is timber is being built from degrading soils around the world. So we're not actually improving the soil stability, and we've got conflict in terms of actually how we get nutrition, where our nutrition systems are declining. So biomaterial without a full system redevelopment of really rebuilding how we hold soils, agroforestry, really rebuilding at the ground source is not really a viable source right now yet. So it's not sufficient as architects say, hey, I got a timber house, Indy, it's all cool. It's not. And every one of the things I'm saying because I think I invite a different architecture. And I think we have to treat this seriously. Because if we don't, what we're talking about, if people ignore this stuff, what we are doing is self-terminating us. 3-degree futures becomes 4-degree futures. And it's not sufficient to say, well, I'm sorry, Indy, this is the best I can do in my industry to keep my job. Sure. But I'm saying there's a whole new paradigm available. A paradigm for architecture to operate in a really radical way. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just about to invite you back up, actually. So in a panel that has promised to turn time on its head, we started with the solution and ended with the problem. And now it's time to problematize the problem. So I'd like to invite all three of our speakers up to the stage to fight it out within the few minutes that we have left. And if it feels at odds with a slow theme, I invite you to remember the last time you did a very hard yoga class and how much you sweated. It's that point in our session right now. Sorry, let's please stay. I can take this corner here. And so we've got, yes, 18 minutes. It's not too bad. And I'd like to start with just a tiny question where I will return to Michael's first presentation here. And I was thinking about a comment that you actually made in an interview in Kuzak recently. Oop, am I standing in the wrong spot if I put this away? Is that less of an echo? Yeah. where you talked about the tension between the specificity that's demanded by reuse projects and standardization as a kind of universal mode of production. Obviously, in Sweden at the moment, we're inhabiting a moment of kind of deep deregulation, I would say, where our standards are being challenged and in fact removed on many levels. Is there a tension in the work that Rotor does with a kind of a difficult relation towards regulation and standardization? I'm sure that Sietse, you have a lot to say on this as well, but I'd love you to start.
But what is sure is that when you work with reclaimed materials and you try to maximize their use value, which is a bit in the line what you just mentioned in your talk, and by the way, it's not a new idea at all. When you look into the chronogram, you will see that in the 1970s, like economists like Kenneth Boulding and Georges Kouroujian and other likes were already making precisely that point. We need to maximize the use value of what is already there and stop producing new things. And but when you do that in practice, you realize that each and every materials you deal with is kind of unique. Maybe it was a standard materials when it left the factory 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, but because of weathering, because of use, it becomes something quite unique, and you need a sort of unique approach to handle them. And this approach requires a lot of labor, and that's also a point, that's also one of the big obstacles we are facing for the moment. You need people that are able to clean one tile in one way and another tile in another way, because it's a different, it has weathered in a different way. And in this sense, like all these ideas and these calls for scaling up reuse or for standardizing that, maybe it can happen for some materials, but it always happens with a sort of a waste production that goes with it. It means that you will focus on maybe 20% of the stock of materials. These will be able to, maybe you will be able to clean them in a machine, but the 80 remaining percent, these you will need to clean them by hand if you want to reuse them. And so in this sense, there is this contradiction between this idea of standardization and reuse. Now, what we also try to say is maybe there are like values behind the standards, this idea that a building shouldn't fall on the people beneath it. That was the example in the container park with the reclaimed and reused glulam timber, which, by the way, we didn't account for the carbon storage that it represents, but it's huge. That's the main reason to do that, of course, is that we give it another go, maybe not 500 years, I wouldn't commit for that, but maybe 50 years. It's already that. But in that case, of course, you don't want the structure to fall on the users beneath. So you need to find a way to demonstrate that this material is fit for its use. But usually it's not the method and all the quality control that we have inherited from 2 centuries of industrialization. Most of the time it doesn't work well with reuse. You need to find another way, maybe something a bit more bespoke. You need to conduct the right test at the right moment. And that's again a sort of friction between this idea of standardization and reuse as a practice.
Right. I mean, I think that this focus on use value rather than exchange value, if we're going to get Marxist about it, is for me kind of central to this whole conversation. And that raises the elephant in the room, I think, which is that no one mentioned the C word, capitalism. And I'd like to pose that question perhaps to Indy first, thinking through how much the mess that we're in right now is being delivered by an economic system that has been in place for a couple of centuries almost. Is your position overtly anti-capitalist? Where do you position the problematization that you've delivered to us in terms of that?
I think the problem is much deeper than that, actually. It goes back to, I would argue, Vitruvian Man and Leonardo da Vinci, and a scale of enlightenment which is rooted in separation. Right? If you think through the world through a series of separation of what it means to be human, but separation from the planet, So allocation, so classification theory, I don't know if you know classification theory, that was all about separation. Perspective was all about distance, subject-object relationships. It's rooted in a philosophical mindset that then also creates the idea of dominion, power over the world. The world is dead, everything is a dead thing to which we have control over. So the primacy of human life versus everything else. So capitalism is just a kind of late-on symbol of that. And I often find it problematic amongst architectural audiences. We all go, we hate capitalism. But actually it's fucking much deeper than that. Right? Capitalism is just a signal function of a much deeper question. And the deeper question is actually, it's about how we imagine ourselves. You know, if you imagine yourselves as separated individuals, which is a hyper-individualist worldview, whereas you don't recognize the fact of the social brain, epigenetics, or even the kind of even quantum tunneling in your brain, which is actually allowing us to think in consciousness beyond what we're talking about, like we have a delusional sense of individualism that's rooted in our theory. And that manifests in capitalism rooted in externalization and extractionism. So I think it's really important to be really rooted into this, and that changes everything. Property theory, it changes subject-object theory, it changes everything, the relationship with our materials worldview. We don't operate from the theory of certainty and confidence, but actually doubt. Doubt is more interesting than certainty and objecthood. So like truth versus truthing, we've become a truth-oriented society, whereas there is no such thing as truth. It's truthing. It's a continuous process of unfurling, finding better behaviors. We've misunderstood our relationship to doubt. And so I slightly worry about the capitalism story because it gets really easy. It's kind of, you know, all of us who are Marxists stand up and go, yeehaw. But it's really problematic if we don't actually really work through this story properly. You know, do we own materials? Do you own 500 years worth of carbon? What's the liability of doing that? So I think there's a completely different narrative at a much more structural sense is where I'd go.
Great. So it's a philosophical and ontological revolution that needs to happen, perhaps more than a traditional Marxist one. I think thinking in terms of a lot of people in this room are architects trained within a particular setting, many probably within Scandinavia. And there we've been really bombarded, I think, with a particular theoretical position, which we might call phenomenology, that really focuses, for good or bad, on the individual experience of space, of aesthetics, of how we feel, of the affective or experiential qualities of architecture, often from the point of view of an older white straight man, but that's beside the point. I think it's really interesting to hear the three of you speak because you're all talking beyond that individual experience. There's an interest here in a positionality within broader structures, whether they're economic, ecological, material, juridical, regulatory, right? There's an attempt to try to get beyond this idea of the one body in space experiencing architecture, that it becomes somehow collective. And I'd like to throw this question then over to Sietse in your role working within this kind of the complex space of urban development, of collective needs, of attempting to, achieve social justice aims within a market system. How do you guys negotiate this this very fraught political territory? And is this independence and autonomy an important ingredient in that?
Is it on? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
You never know when you speak
yeah,
into this mic.
Yeah.
It
And
comes
every
on.
single question I'm going to give is going to sound silly now after the dissertation. To answer your question, I think the neutral position is in a way working that because like we as the Bouwmeester, we don't talk about how the buildings look. That's the first thing. We talk about livability, sociability, and also kind of the construction manner. And not so certainly, we don't talk about like what's the kind of materials there were, because they become too very individual. We actually go for the social goodness of the thing, but also of the reuse of the materials. So in a way, as a Bouwmeester, we can stand between the administration and the developers as a middleman in a way. Otherwise, it's just the two of them together pitched against each other. We, from a neutral position, we can be the glue, but also we can also kind of push those new ideas in a way and to usher up the quality, the spatial quality in general in a way. So I think the neutral position is very, very strong. That's why I also underlined it during the presentation in a way.
Yeah, because I mean, I guess we're very used to the debate of aesthetic quality, and many of us in this room would be at the forefront of that every day in what we do. Every time you draw a line, it's a matter of discussion and debate. It means something.
You have to learn it as well a little bit, because I've been an architect, and we always talk about like spaces, but also about aesthetics. But once that I've been working out the Bouwmeester, for me, sometimes a little architect is still sitting on my shoulder thinking like, oh, it doesn't look like it. But then it's about quality of space and the quality of livability, where uses of spaces as well, double uses, maybe triple uses, like it goes behind the just aesthetical kind of building structure. It's more and broader than that in a way.
I really appreciate this this sense that you're working for a user who is the entire city, is the entire population of that city. I think we're moving towards the end of the conversation. I'd like to ask one of the harder questions, which is to do with this idea of perhaps degrowth, we might call it, or the construction stop was mentioned earlier by your colleagues in presenting the exhibition installation downstairs. And I think that when we think about moving towards a point where we can no longer build or build in the same ways, we also have to question then who it is, which part of the population of a city we're requesting to make their lives more efficient, who it is that's going to have less, who it is who's going to have to squish into less room, who it is who's going to have to renounce worldly goods, and if that's something that we're going to apply to everybody. Obviously, we live in a world of deep inequity and in terms of spatial wealth. And so, Indy, I'd like to ask you this question about redistribution. Is that part of what's on the cards here? If we can no longer build, do we need to think about who owns and has access to existing spaces?
Fundamentally, if we're operating in a sufficiency landscape, the question we end up with is this. If you end up with a degrowth or zero growth story, which I think in material terms we're going to have to end up with, we're also going to end up with forced redistribution, right? Because if you have something and I don't have it, then the only way for me to get it is to take it from you, right? And that's a sort of landscape of conflict, fundamentally. At the same time, if we carry on growing, we're going to kill ourselves. So we're going to have to make a very tight transition of an intangibles economy, which is going to have to grow massively, and we're going to have to make our material economy sufficient, and we're going to have to make our biomaterial economy regenerative. And these three things have to happen simultaneously. So if you look at really great architects actually build narratives around their building. Right? What they're selling is the intangible of the narrative, not just the building. So if you look at a balance sheet of a future building, it will be as much as the social narratives as it will be the material flows, as well as the long-term liabilities, as well as the value it generates in a fundamental way. Also, if your building's lying empty, is that a problem? Like, are you hoarding assets not able for social use? So should there be a penalty for buildings that are lying empty fundamentally? Right? So I don't know Brussels, but if you look at, right, massively, you would be paying huge amounts of penalties, right? If you're at buildings like empty. So I think there is going to have to be a new social recognition around that, but we have to do it in a smart way. That's why I don't believe in the simple narratives of degrowth or regrowth. You're going to have to massively grow the intangibles economy, because that's where the infinite possible exists. We're going to have to actually make sufficiency our material economy pathway, and we have to grow a generative biomaterial economy. These three things have to happen simultaneously to create the social contract. And that changes architecture if we really think it through. And like people like Ivana and Alex in the room are working on a lot of that stuff. So I just want to say that this isn't a dead end. But my worry is that we are not embracing the constraints because we want to carry on business as usual. And that, I think, is a problem, right? So it isn't sufficient for Brussels to look after Brussels, right? Because if Brussels only looks after Brussels and kills sort of other parts of the world, those violences will come back, right? So this applies to London, this applies to anyone, right? So all of us are doing it. This is not about Brussels, it's not about London, it's not about Malmo. We're all a part of this process, but it requires a systematic change.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess Brussels is a good example because it's also the wealth of the most beautiful buildings in Brussels come from a colonial history that is literally Brussels killing other parts of the world in resource terms, right? So this is a decolonial conversation. It's a conversation about capitalism. It's a conversation about spatial resources, and it's not an easy one. I don't think we've landed in one solution here or one question
I think that's nearly impossible in 15 minutes.
Exactly, I'm doing my best here. But I would like to maybe come back then to the core of today's considerations. And Michael, you open, so perhaps there's a circularity to allowing you to close as well. And I'm really obsessed with this chronogram that you presented. I'm looking forward to digging through that in greater detail. For those who had to read the Charles Jenks version in architectural history in second year, it might offer a really important revision for us. But here, this idea of the collapse of like a grand narrative is always linked, and we talked about authorship earlier, to the idea of the architect. And it seems to me that your practice points to other ways of doing, other ways of working. What do you think that the architecture role needs to do in order to kind of shift in this landscape that Indy has so articulately sketched for us? Do we need to be architects anymore? Are we heading somewhere very different?
It's almost a question, I don't know, a fundamental question, but a personal one. But I studied architecture, but I never considered myself as an architect. And I knew from maybe year 2 or year 3 that I wouldn't be like building or designing things. And I think Rotor for me was a sort of safe place where I could explore other ways of practicing a form of architecture, and we are constantly flirting with architecture, but never really building ourselves. And even in the design project that we accompany, we try to retain designers from designing, but rather like trying to find the quality in what is already there. And that requires a sort of a change in how you look at things, how you value things. We do that pretty good at the scale of materials. I think all the methods we have developed for that could be applied at the scale of complete building as well. Can you find beautiful, the what you called banal or sometimes even ugly buildings from the 1990s? We cannot afford anymore to demolish them, so we have to learn to live with them, and that requires a change in how you relate to things, and that's why we try to explore in our very humble way, I would say.
Thank you. I think that I'm going to be haunted by the image, Sietse, that you had of the little architect inside you sitting on your shoulder, sometimes instructing you on how to act. And perhaps architecture then becomes a moral discipline, a question of philosophy, of ontology, of exactly these kind of conversations. And so with that, I would like to thank the organizers for making space for this kind of conversation and the audience for joining us. And if we could put our hands together, first and foremost, for our invited guests. Thank you so much.